Sometimes the most dangerous prison is built by the people who love you most. Dontrell Hayes had been watching the black SUV parked across from Blackstone Financial for 17 minutes, his military-trained instincts screaming warnings that had nothing to do with his custodial duties and everything to do with 15 years of combat experience in environments where vigilance meant survival. The vehicle's positioning was too perfect. Optimal sight lines to the building's main entrance, easy escape routes, tinted windows that concealed occupants while allowing clear observation. Two men had exited 40 minutes earlier to establish foot surveillance positions that would have been invisible to civilian security, but were glaringly obvious to someone trained in tactical reconnaissance. "Dad," 12-year-old Kieran whispered from beside him in the building's marble lobby where he was supposedly working on homework while waiting for Dontrell's night shift to begin. "You have that look again, the one you get when you're seeing things other people miss." At 44, Dontrell had spent 3 years successfully suppressing the hypervigilance that had defined his military service as a force protection specialist. The constant threat assessment, the automatic evaluation of escape routes, the reflexive identification of potential ambush positions, all skills that had kept him alive in Afghanistan but felt paranoid and excessive in Manhattan corporate environments. But watching the surveillance pattern developing around Blackstone Financial, Dontrell's training was impossible to ignore. Someone was preparing to intercept a high-value target, and the timing suggested they knew exactly when that target would be vulnerable. "Kieran, I need you to move to the security desk and stay with Marcus," Dontrell said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned during military operations that required immediate compliance without panic. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Probably nothing, but I want you somewhere safe while I check on something." Dontrell approached Marcus Webb, the head of corporate security, who was the only person in the building aware of Dontrell's military background. Marcus had served 2 tours in Iraq and recognized the controlled alertness that characterized veterans processing potential threats. "Marcus, we might have a problem," Dontrell said, positioning himself where he could monitor both the lobby entrances and the street through floor-to-ceiling windows. Black SUV across the street, 2-man foot surveillance team, positioning consistent with abduction preparation. Marcus immediately shifted to tactical awareness, his hand moving unconsciously toward the concealed weapon he carried as head of corporate security. "Target has to be Isabella Blackstone. She's due for pickup in 12 minutes, same schedule she's maintained for 6 weeks. Whoever's running this operation has been doing reconnaissance." Isabella Blackstone, 16-year-old daughter of CEO Victoria Blackstone, followed a rigidly controlled routine that made her movements predictable to anyone who bothered to observe. Private school pickup at 4:15, arrival at Blackstone Financial at 4:30, homework in her mother's office until 7 p.m. when they departed together for home. The routine was designed for security through predictability, but it also created vulnerability windows that professional criminals could exploit. "Should I alert Ms. Blackstone?" Marcus asked, reaching for his radio to contact Victoria's executive protection team. "Not yet. Let me confirm the threat before we trigger corporate panic protocols." Dontrell moved toward the building's side entrance, using reflective surfaces to monitor the surveillance team without appearing to conduct counter-surveillance. His movement patterns were casual but systematic, designed to gather intelligence while maintaining the appearance of routine custodial duties. The foot surveillance team was professional, but not military-trained. Their positioning was adequate for civilian law enforcement, but showed gaps that indicated private security or criminal organization rather than government operative expertise. 2 additional vehicles had arrived during his observation, a delivery van with modified rear compartments and a sedan with engine modifications visible through the grille. This was definitely an abduction setup. At 4:28, Isabella's armored sedan pulled up to the building's main entrance, exactly 2 minutes early, but still within the predictable arrival window that made interception possible. Dontrell watched the surveillance team activate, moving to positions that would allow rapid coordination once Isabella exited her vehicle. "Kieran," Dontrell called to his son, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without asking questions." Kieran looked up from his homework with the serious expression he'd learned to use when his father shifted into tactical mode, the voice and posture that indicated genuine danger requiring immediate compliance. Isabella emerged from her sedan with the casual indifference of someone who had never experienced real threat. Her attention focused on her phone rather than environmental awareness. She moved through the lobby with the confident entitlement that came from 16 years of wealth and security, unaware that her predictable routine had been compromised. Dontrell recognized the exact moment when the abduction team would strike. Isabella would exit the building alone at 7 p.m. Her mother's executive protection would be focused on Victoria rather than perimeter security, and the street lighting would provide cover for rapid vehicle approach. But something else was wrong. Isabella's behavior didn't match someone unaware of potential threat. Her movements were too deliberate, her phone usage too performative, her positioning within the lobby too strategic for someone genuinely focused on homework. She knew. "Marcus," Dontrell said through the security radio, "Isabella Blackstone is aware of the surveillance team. This might not be a standard abduction attempt." Before Marcus could respond, Isabella approached Dontrell directly, her expression carrying the desperate determination of someone about to make an irreversible decision. "Mr. Hayes," Isabella said, using his name despite never having been formally introduced, "I need you to let something happen tonight that might look dangerous but isn't meant to hurt anyone." The request confirmed Dontrell's worst suspicion. This wasn't a criminal abduction targeting the Blackstone family fortune. This was a 16-year-old girl who had orchestrated her own kidnapping as an escape mechanism from circumstances she couldn't otherwise control. "Isabella, whatever you're planning, there are better ways to solve family problems." "You don't understand," Isabella replied, her voice carrying the brittle edge that preceded emotional breakdown. "There are no better ways. My mother controls every minute of my life, monitors every conversation I have, approves every person I'm allowed to know. This is the only way I can get enough distance to make her listen to me." Dontrell felt the familiar weight of operational decision-making settling over him. His training demanded preventing the abduction regardless of Isabella's consent, but his experience with traumatized civilians suggested that forcing unwilling protection often created more damage than the original threat. "Isabella, fake kidnappings can become real kidnappings very quickly. The people you're working with don't have your best interests as their primary motivation. They promised they wouldn't hurt me. They just want enough money to disappear, and I want enough freedom to breathe. Everyone gets what they need." The naivety was heartbreaking and dangerous. Isabella had no understanding of criminal psychology, operational security, or the ways that planned crimes could escalate beyond control once they began. "Kieran," Dontrell said quietly, "call 911 and report suspicious vehicles outside the building. Tell them you're the son of building security and that you've been instructed to report potential threats." "Dad, are you going to stop her?" "I'm going to keep her alive, which might mean stopping her." At 6:45, 15 minutes before Isabella's planned departure, Dontrell made his choice. Using hand signals developed during military operations, he directed Kieran to alert Marcus while moving to intercept the abduction team before they could approach Isabella. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Dontrell's approach neutralized the foot surveillance team through techniques that relied on psychological dominance rather than physical violence, while Marcus coordinated with NYPD to detain the occupants of the suspicious vehicles. By 7:15, the abduction team was in custody, and Isabella was sitting in her mother's office, facing consequences she hadn't anticipated when she'd planned what she thought would be a controlled rebellion against maternal authority. "Mr. Hayes," Isabella said as police completed their interviews and evidence collection, "you just destroyed the only chance I had to make my mother understand that her protection is killing me." That's in. The statement was delivered without gratitude, without recognition that Dontrell had prevented her from experiencing genuine danger, without awareness that her harmless plan could have resulted in permanent trauma or death. "Isabella, there are legal ways to address family conflicts that don't involve collaborating with criminals who could have decided to hold you for real ransom or worse. Legal ways that require my mother to voluntarily give up control she's never willing to relinquish," Isabella shot back. "You saved my life from danger I created, but you didn't save me from the life I can't escape." As Victoria Blackstone arrived at the building with her executive protection team, her face showing the terror and rage of a mother whose child had been endangered, Dontrell realized that preventing Isabella's physical harm might have been the easier challenge. The harder challenge would be helping a family understand the difference between protection and imprisonment, between love and control, between keeping someone safe and keeping them from living. Some rescues, Dontrell was learning, required saving people from circumstances they couldn't escape rather than threats they couldn't survive. The confrontation between Victoria and Isabella took place in Victoria's corner office at 8 p.m., with Dontrell and Kieran serving as reluctant witnesses to a family crisis that had been years in the making. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's skyline glittered with the promise of freedom that felt impossibly distant to a 16-year-old girl who commanded vast wealth but possessed no autonomy. "How could you do this?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone whose worst fears had nearly materialized. "Do you have any idea what could have happened if those men had decided to actually kidnap you?" Isabella sat in the leather chair across from her mother's desk, her teenage defiance beginning to crumble as the adrenaline of her failed escape attempt gave way to recognition of the genuine danger she'd courted. "I knew what I was doing," Isabella replied, but her voice lacked the conviction she'd displayed earlier. "I researched the people I contacted. They were professionals who just needed money, not violent criminals." "Professionals." Victoria's tone carried the disbelief of someone whose business experience included extensive knowledge of criminal organizations and their methods. "Isabella, you contacted strangers on the dark web and gave them our family's security information. There is no version of that scenario that ends safely." Dontrell remained standing near the office door, positioned where he could monitor both the family conversation and potential external threats, while Kieran sat quietly in a corner chair, observing family dynamics that were completely foreign to his own experience of single-parent households built on mutual trust rather than protective control. "Ms. Blackstone," Dontrell said carefully, recognizing that intervening in family disputes was both necessary and professionally dangerous, "maybe we should focus on understanding why Isabella felt that fake kidnapping was her only option for addressing whatever concerns she has about her current living situation." Victoria turned toward Dontrell with the sharp attention she typically reserved for hostile board meetings. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your intervention tonight, but family therapy isn't part of your job description." "No, ma'am. But threat assessment is part of my background, and the biggest threat to Isabella's safety tonight wasn't the criminal she contacted. It was her desperation to escape circumstances she couldn't otherwise change." The observation was both tactful and pointed, suggesting that Isabella's security vulnerabilities stemmed from family dynamics rather than external criminal threats. "What circumstances?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying genuine confusion rather than defensive anger. Isabella has every advantage wealth can provide: private education, travel opportunities, cultural enrichment, personal security that keeps her safe from exactly the kind of danger she voluntarily sought tonight. Isabella looked at her mother with the exhausted expression of someone who had tried repeatedly to explain needs that couldn't be purchased or controlled. "Mom, I have advantages, but I don't have choices. You decide where I go to school, who I'm allowed to be friends with, what activities I can participate in, when I can leave the house, who I can talk to, what I can post on social media. I'm 16 years old, and I have less freedom than Kieran, whose father works as a janitor." Kieran looked up from his homework at the mention of his name, his expression thoughtful as he processed the comparison between his family's economic limitations and Isabella's experiential restrictions. "Isabella," Victoria said, "those aren't restrictions, they're protections. You're the daughter of one of the wealthiest women in America. Without security protocols, you're vulnerable to exactly the kind of people you voluntarily contacted tonight. But what's the point of being alive if I'm not allowed to live?" The question hung in the office air like a challenge to everything Victoria had built her parenting philosophy around. For 16 years, she'd prioritized Isabella's physical safety over every other consideration, creating comprehensive security that had prevented external threats while generating internal rebellion. "Isabella," Dontrell said, "can you help your mother understand what kind of normal teenage experiences you feel like you're missing? I want to go to public school, where I can make friends without background checks being run on their families. I want to go to movies or restaurants without security details that make everyone uncomfortable. I want to have sleepovers and go to parties and maybe eventually have a boyfriend who isn't intimidated by the fact that bodyguards monitor all my social interactions." Each item on Isabella's list represented reasonable teenage desires that had been eliminated through security protocols designed to prevent every possible threat to her physical well-being. "And I want to feel like my mother trusts me to make good decisions instead of assuming that any unsupervised moment will result in disaster," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength as she articulated frustrations she'd been carrying for years. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, processing her daughter's requests through the lens of threat assessment that had governed every parenting decision since Isabella's birth. "Isabella, the threats against our family are real. We receive credible kidnapping threats monthly. Our security team has documented surveillance attempts, extortion schemes, and infiltration attempts that target you specifically because hurting you would devastate me. But Mum, living in constant fear of theoretical threats isn't actually living. Tonight was the first time in years that I felt like I had agency over my own life, even though I chose something dangerous and stupid." Kieran had been listening to this exchange with the fascination of someone observing lifestyle challenges completely different from his own family's concerns, and now he spoke up with 12-year-old directness that cut through adult diplomatic complexity. "Ms. Blackstone, my dad lets me walk to school alone and hang out with friends at the park, but he also taught me how to recognize dangerous situations and who to call if I feel unsafe. Maybe Isabella needs to learn how to stay safe instead of just being kept safe." The suggestion was simple but profound, highlighting the difference between protective education and protective isolation. "Kieran makes a good point," Dontrell added, recognizing an opportunity to bridge the gap between Victoria's legitimate security concerns and Isabella's reasonable autonomy needs. "Military protective operations work best when the protected person understands potential threats and knows how to respond appropriately, rather than being kept ignorant of dangers while relying entirely on external security." Victoria studied Dontrell's face, processing his suggestion through her business experience with security consultations and risk management strategies. Are you suggesting that Isabella needs security training rather than just security services? I'm suggesting that intelligent protection involves teaching people to recognize and avoid threats while gradually expanding their independence rather than eliminating all potential risks through complete isolation. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Victoria gradually recognizing that her protective strategies had created exactly the kind of desperation that led to poor decision-making she'd been trying to prevent. "Isabella," Victoria said finally, "if we restructured your security to allow more normal teenage experiences while maintaining safety protocols, would you commit to never again collaborating with criminals to solve family problems?" "Mom, if you let me participate in creating security arrangements that respect my need for some independence, I'll commit to following them consistently and communicating with you when I feel like they're not working." The negotiation was both touching and practical, representing the first genuine collaboration between mother and daughter that either had experienced in years. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria said, "would you be willing to consult on developing security protocols that balance Isabella's safety with her developmental need for increasing independence?" Dontrell felt the familiar mixture of professional opportunity and personal risk that came with assignments that could transform his family's circumstances while potentially exposing them to complications beyond his control. "Ms. Blackstone, I'd be honored to help, but I want to be clear about my qualifications and limitations. I have military experience with protective operations, but I'm not a licensed security consultant or family therapist. Any advice I provide would be based on practical experience rather than formal credentials." "Mr. Hayes, practical experience is exactly what we need. Isabella's current security team includes former Secret Service agents and private military contractors, but none of them understand how to help a teenage girl develop independence while staying safe." As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for follow-up consultations, both Victoria and Isabella recognized that they were beginning a process that would require fundamental changes in their relationship dynamic. "Dad," Kieran said as they prepared to leave the office, "Isabella's problem is kind of like the opposite of our problem. We don't have enough money for lots of choices, but she has lots of money but isn't allowed to choose anything." The 12-year-old's observation captured the complexity of circumstances where privilege could become limitation, where resources could create restrictions, and where protection could transform into imprisonment. Some family problems, Dontrell realized, required not just preventing external threats, but addressing internal conflicts that made protection feel like punishment rather than care. The question now was whether his military experience with security operations could help a billionaire family learn that effective protection required trust, communication, and graduated independence rather than just comprehensive control. 2 weeks after preventing Isabella's staged kidnapping, Dontrell found himself in the unprecedented position of conducting family security consultations from the same conference room where he'd once emptied trash cans at 2 a.m. The transition from invisible custodial worker to trusted advisor had happened so rapidly that he still felt disoriented by the marble table where he now sat across from one of America's most powerful CEOs. "Dontrell," Victoria said, reviewing the comprehensive security assessment he'd prepared, "your recommendations are more detailed than reports I've received from firms that charge me $50,000 for threat analysis." The document outlined a graduated independence program that would allow Isabella increasing autonomy while maintaining protective oversight, appropriate to genuine rather than imagined threats. But implementing the plan would require Victoria to relinquish control she'd maintained for 16 years, while trusting Dontrell's judgment about risks she'd spent decades trying to eliminate. Ms. Blackstone, the key is understanding that teenage development requires progressively expanding decision-making opportunities. Complete protection prevents Isabella from learning how to recognize and respond to genuine threats, which actually makes her more vulnerable when she eventually gains independence. Isabella sat beside her mother, engaged in the security planning for the first time since childhood, her expression showing the cautious hope of someone who had never been consulted about arrangements that governed every aspect of her daily life. "But what about the threats we know are real?" Victoria asked, producing files that documented kidnapping attempts, extortion schemes, and surveillance operations targeting their family over the past 5 years. These aren't theoretical concerns. They're documented criminal activities that could result in Isabella's injury or death. Dontrell studied the threat assessments with the analytical attention he'd brought to military intelligence reports, recognizing patterns that suggested both legitimate dangers and security theater designed to justify excessive restrictions. Ms. Blackstone, approximately 40% of these threats appear credible and require ongoing protective measures. The other 60% are opportunistic schemes that would be deterred by standard personal security practices rather than the comprehensive isolation protocols Isabella's been living under. The distinction was crucial for developing security arrangements that addressed real dangers without eliminating normal teenage experiences that posed minimal actual risk. "What I'm proposing is a 3-tier system," Dontrell continued, advancing to a presentation slide that outlined graduated security responses. High-risk activities require full protective details and pre-approval. Medium-risk activities require check-in protocols and situational awareness training. Low-risk activities require only standard safety practices that any responsible teenager should follow. Isabella leaned forward with interest that suggested this was the first security discussion that had ever included consideration of her actual needs and preferences. "What would be considered low-risk activities?" Isabella asked. "School attendance with friends, supervised social events, age-appropriate recreational activities in secure environments. Essentially, normal teenage experiences that don't involve overnight trips, large public gatherings, or contact with unknown adults." Victoria processed this information with the strategic thinking she brought to business negotiations, but her maternal instincts resisted any arrangement that didn't provide complete control over Isabella's potential exposure to danger. "Dontrell, what happens if we implement graduated independence and Isabella encounters a threat situation we didn't anticipate? How do I live with the responsibility of knowingly exposing my daughter to risks I could have prevented?" The question touched the core of Dontrell's own struggles with protective parenting, particularly his anxiety about balancing Kieran's need for age-appropriate freedom with awareness of dangers that most 12-year-olds never had to consider. "Ms. Blackstone, respectfully, the current system hasn't eliminated risk, it's transferred it. Instead of risking external threats, Isabella is experiencing psychological damage from isolation and making increasingly dangerous decisions to escape circumstances she can't tolerate." Dontrell paused, recognizing that his next observation might jeopardize his consulting arrangement, but feeling obligated to address the underlying family dynamics that created security vulnerabilities. Additionally, comprehensive control teaches Isabella that she can't be trusted with her own safety, which means she'll be unprepared to protect herself when she eventually gains independence through age or rebellion. The conversation was interrupted by Kieran, who appeared in the conference room doorway with the patient expression he used when adult meetings extended beyond his homework completion time. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson called to confirm that I'm still planning to attend Jeremy's birthday party on Saturday. She wanted to make sure you remembered to sign the permission slip for the laser tag venue." The mundane parental responsibility highlighted exactly the kind of normal social activity that Isabella had been denied through security protocols designed to eliminate any possibility of unsupervised interaction with peers. "Kieran, go ahead and tell Mrs. Patterson I'll drop off the permission slip tomorrow," Dontrell replied, then turned to Victoria and Isabella. "This is what I mean about graduated independence. Kieran is 12, and I allow him to attend supervised peer activities because the social and developmental benefits outweigh the minimal security risks." Isabella looked at Kieran with something approaching envy, recognizing that this 12-year-old boy from a working-class family possessed social freedoms she'd never experienced despite her family's vast resources. "Ms. Blackstone," Isabella said quietly, "I've never been to a birthday party that wasn't planned and supervised by our security team. I've never had a sleepover or gone to a school dance or even been to a movie theater with friends." The admission was devastating in its simplicity, revealing the social isolation that had resulted from 16 years of comprehensive protection designed to prevent every possible threat. "Isabella, those restrictions were necessary because of credible threats against our family," Victoria replied, but her voice carried less conviction than usual as she confronted the emotional cost of her security decisions. "But Mom, what's the point of protecting me from external dangers if the protection itself prevents me from developing the relationships and experiences that make life worth living?" Before Victoria could respond, Marcus Webb appeared at the conference room entrance with the urgent expression he used for genuine security concerns. "Ms. Blackstone, we've detected surveillance activity around Isabella's school and your residence that suggests renewed interest from the criminal organization we disrupted 2 weeks ago. It appears they're conducting reconnaissance for a potential operation." The threat assessment immediately shifted the family's focus from theoretical security arrangements to immediate protective concerns that could affect Isabella's safety within hours rather than months. "What kind of surveillance?" Dontrell asked, automatically transitioning to tactical mode as he processed the intelligence Marcus was providing. "Vehicle surveillance, pedestrian reconnaissance, and electronic monitoring attempts that suggest a coordinated effort to identify vulnerability windows in Isabella's routine." Victoria's face went pale as she realized that Isabella's staged kidnapping had attracted attention from legitimate criminal organizations who saw the family's security disruption as an opportunity for actual extortion attempts. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Victoria said, her voice carrying the vindicated anxiety of someone whose worst-case scenarios were being confirmed by events. Isabella's rebellion created security vulnerabilities that actual criminals are now trying to exploit. Isabella looked stricken as she processed that her attempt to escape protective control had potentially endangered not just herself but her entire family by revealing weaknesses in their security systems. "Ms. Blackstone," Dontrell said, "the current threat requires immediate protective measures, but it doesn't invalidate our long-term planning for graduated independence. It means we need to implement enhanced security while we neutralize this specific danger." "How long will enhanced security be necessary?" Isabella asked, recognizing that her brief taste of potential freedom might be delayed indefinitely by consequences of her previous poor judgment. "Depends on how quickly we can identify and disrupt the surveillance operation," Marcus replied. "Could be days, could be weeks, could be months if they're well organized and patient." The timeline was devastating for Isabella, who had just begun to hope that her relationship with her mother might evolve toward greater trust and independence. "Isabella," Dontrell said, recognizing the despair in her expression, "this setback doesn't mean we abandon our plans for expanding your autonomy. It means we demonstrate that you can follow enhanced security protocols responsibly while we address immediate threats." "But what if there are always immediate threats? What if this is just how my life is going to be forever, locked up for my own protection while criminals decide whether I'm allowed to have normal experiences?" The question revealed Isabella's deepest fear, that she would never escape the cycle of threat and protection that had defined her entire adolescence. "Isabella," Victoria said, her voice carrying a resolve that surprised both herself and her daughter. "I promise you that we will find ways to give you the independence you need while keeping you safe. But right now, we need to focus on neutralizing people who want to hurt you for reasons that have nothing to do with your development or our family relationship." As Marcus coordinated enhanced security measures and Dontrell developed tactical protocols for protecting Isabella during the current threat period, both men recognized that they were defending not just her physical safety, but her psychological well-being during a crisis that could either strengthen or destroy her emerging trust in her mother's willingness to balance protection with autonomy. Some sacrifices, Dontrell was learning, involved accepting increased personal risk to help families navigate threats that could either unite them through shared challenge or divide them through fear and control. The question now was whether their collaborative approach to security could survive external pressure designed to exploit the very family tensions they were working to resolve. 6 weeks into the enhanced security protocol that followed the renewed criminal surveillance, Victoria found herself in unfamiliar territory. Sitting in her daughter's bedroom at 10 p.m., helping Isabella process the psychological impact of living under protective restrictions while criminals planned potential attacks against their family. "Mom," Isabella said, looking up from homework she'd been struggling to complete despite the academic tutors Victoria employed to maintain educational continuity during security crises. "I know I caused this situation by planning that fake kidnapping, but I don't know how to stop feeling guilty about putting everyone in danger." The confession revealed emotional maturity that had developed through weeks of confronting the consequences of decisions that had seemed rebellious rather than genuinely dangerous when Isabella had made them. "Isabella, you made a serious mistake in judgment, but the people threatening us now are responsible for their own criminal choices," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the patient tone she'd learned during sessions with the family therapist Dontrell had recommended. "Your guilt is understandable, but it's not productive for solving our current security challenges." The conversation was taking place in Isabella's bedroom because Dontrell had suggested that enhanced security shouldn't eliminate all parent-child intimacy and that Victoria needed to maintain emotional connection with Isabella during circumstances that could easily create additional distance between them. "Ms. Blackstone," Dontrell had explained during one of their security planning sessions, "isolation protocols that separate families during crisis periods often create more psychological damage than the external threats they're designed to prevent." Victoria had initially resisted the recommendation, preferring to maintain professional boundaries that kept family discussions separate from security operations. But 6 weeks of watching Isabella struggle with depression and anxiety had convinced her that effective protection required addressing emotional as well as physical vulnerability. "Isabella, can I ask you something honestly?" Victoria said, settling more comfortably in the chair beside Isabella's bed. "Before the kidnapping incident, did you feel like I didn't care about your happiness? Or did you feel like I cared more about controlling you than understanding what you needed?" The question was both vulnerable and strategic, representing Victoria's first attempt to understand Isabella's perspective, rather than simply defending her own protective decisions. "I felt like you loved me so much that you couldn't imagine letting me experience anything that might hurt me, even if preventing pain meant preventing everything that makes life interesting," Isabella replied after considering her response carefully. "And now? Now I feel like you're learning to trust me with small risks while we deal with this big risk together. It's different from being protected by you without being included in protection decisions." Oh, the distinction was subtle but crucial, highlighting the difference between protective collaboration and protective control that had characterized their relationship for years. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on Isabella's bedroom door, followed by Kyron's voice, asking for permission to enter. "Come in, sweetheart," Victoria said, having learned to appreciate Kyron's perspective on family dynamics during the weeks he'd spent accompanying his father to security consultations. "Miss Victoria, Dad wanted me to tell you that the surveillance team identified two of the people watching your house, and they think they can arrest them tomorrow without compromising the investigation of the larger criminal organization." Kieran delivered this information with the calm professionalism he'd developed through exposure to his father's work, treating security updates as routine family business rather than crisis management. "That's excellent news," Victoria replied, recognizing that positive developments in threat mitigation would allow them to begin implementing the graduated independence plan they'd developed before the current security emergency. "Ms. Victoria," Kieran continued, "Isabella asked me to research schools in Manhattan that have good security but also normal social activities. I made a list of 5 schools that might work if you decide she can transfer somewhere that feels less like protective custody." The research project revealed ongoing collaboration between the children that had developed during weeks of shared security restrictions, with Kieran serving as Isabella's connection to normal teenage perspectives she'd never been able to access. "Kieran, that's very thoughtful," Isabella said, "but I want to make sure changing schools doesn't create security complications that make things harder for everyone." Victoria felt surprised pride in Isabella's consideration for collective family well-being, recognizing emotional growth that had emerged through weeks of confronting the real consequences of her previous self-centered decision-making. "Isabella, we'll evaluate school options once the current threat is resolved, but your willingness to consider everyone's needs shows exactly the kind of judgment I'd want to see before expanding your independence." The validation was both earned and significant, representing Victoria's first explicit acknowledgement that Isabella was developing the emotional maturity required for greater autonomy. "Ms. Blackstone," Dontrell said, appearing in the doorway to provide the security update Kyron had announced. "Marcus has coordinated with NYPD to execute arrests tomorrow morning that should disrupt the surveillance operation and reduce immediate threats to acceptable levels." "How long before we know whether the arrests have eliminated the danger?" Victoria asked. "Probably 2 to 3 weeks for a complete assessment, but we should know within 72 hours whether the criminal organization has additional capabilities that require ongoing protective measures." The timeline was both hopeful and uncertain, providing enough optimism to plan for reduced security while acknowledging that threats could persist longer than anyone preferred. "Dad," Kieran said, "if the dangerous people get arrested and Isabella doesn't have to worry about being kidnapped anymore, will she be able to do normal things like go to school and hang out with friends?" "That's the plan, buddy. The goal has always been helping Isabella stay safe while having the kind of life experiences that teenagers need for healthy development." Isabella looked at Kieran with genuine affection, recognizing that this 12-year-old boy had become one of her closest friends during circumstances that had isolated her from peer relationships she'd spent years wanting to develop. "Kieran, when this is over and I can do normal teenager things, will you help me figure out how to make friends who aren't scared of my family's money or security people?" "Isabella, I think most kids our age care more about whether you're nice and fun to be around than about how much money your family has. But you might need to practice talking about regular stuff instead of just complaining about being protected all the time." Ooh. The observation was both honest and helpful, providing Isabella with practical social guidance she'd never received from adults who were either intimidated by her wealth or paid to accommodate her preferences. "That's actually really good advice," Victoria said, appreciating Kieran's directness about social skills that couldn't be purchased or controlled through security protocols. As the security briefing concluded and plans were finalized for the next day's law enforcement operations, all 4 members of their extended family unit understood that they were approaching a transition point that could either validate their collaborative approach to security or reveal additional challenges that required further adaptation. "Isabella," Victoria said as Dontrell and Kieran prepared to leave, "regardless of what happens with the criminal investigation, I want you to know that these past weeks have taught me something important about parenting." "What's that?" "That protecting you means preparing you to make good decisions when I'm not available to make them for you. The enhanced security we've been living under isn't sustainable long-term, so you need to develop skills for recognizing and avoiding dangers independently." The acknowledgement represented fundamental shift in Victoria's parenting philosophy, moving from comprehensive control toward collaborative preparation that honored Isabella's developmental needs. "Mum, these past weeks have also taught me something about being your daughter," Isabella replied. "I understand now that your protection comes from love, not control, and that rebelling against safety measures puts everyone I care about at risk." As Dontrell and Kieran returned to their apartment and Victoria and Isabella continued their evening conversation, both families recognized that external threats had created opportunities for internal growth that might not have occurred under normal circumstances. Some alliances, they were discovering, were strengthened rather than weakened by adversity that required mutual trust, shared responsibility, and collaborative problem-solving that transcended traditional family hierarchies. The question now was whether their partnership could maintain its effectiveness once the immediate crisis passed, and they had to navigate normal family and security challenges without the unifying pressure of external danger. The arrests of the surveillance team that had been monitoring the Blackstone family proceeded exactly as planned at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, but by 2:15 p.m. that same afternoon, Dontrell received intelligence that transformed their security situation from manageable threat to immediate crisis, requiring every tactical skill he'd developed during 15 years of military operations. "The people we arrested this morning were decoys," Marcus explained during the emergency briefing he'd called in Victoria's office, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that would change everything they thought they understood about their safety. "The real kidnapping team has been using them as distractions while positioning for an actual abduction attempt that could happen within the next 6 hours. Victoria felt her chest tighten with familiar panic, recognizing that her worst fears about Isabella's vulnerability were materializing despite weeks of enhanced security and collaborative planning designed to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. "What kind of intelligence do we have about their capabilities and timeline?" Dontrell asked, automatically shifting to tactical assessment mode as he processed information that indicated professional criminal operations rather than opportunistic threats. "Intercepted communications suggest a 4-person team with military training, sophisticated equipment, and detailed knowledge of our security protocols," Marcus replied, distributing photographs and biographical information that revealed the scope of the threat they were facing. "They've been conducting reconnaissance for over 2 months, mapping not just Isabella's routines, but our response patterns, backup protocols, and the locations where we thought she'd be safest during emergency situations." The revelation meant that every security measure they'd implemented had been observed and countered by people whose expertise matched or exceeded their own protective capabilities. "Where's Isabella now?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the controlled fear of a mother whose child was exposed to danger she couldn't prevent through wealth or authority. "She's in the secure conference room with Kieran," Dontrell replied, "but we need to relocate both children to a facility that hasn't been compromised by surveillance." The decision to move Isabella and Kieran together had been strategic, Separating them would require dividing protective resources while eliminating the psychological support they provided each other during crisis situations. The safe house is 40 minutes away, under normal traffic conditions, Marcus continued, but we have reason to believe the kidnapping team is planning to intercept any vehicle that leaves this building during the next several hours. Victoria realized that they were facing exactly the kind of sophisticated threat she'd spent 16 years trying to prevent, implemented by people who had studied her family's vulnerabilities with professional thoroughness that made their protective measures feel inadequate. "What are our options?" Victoria asked. "We can maintain defensive positions here and wait for additional law enforcement support," Marcus said. "Or we can attempt proactive disruption of their operation before they're ready to execute the abduction." Dontrell understood that the choice between defensive and offensive responses would determine not just Isabella's immediate safety, but the psychological impact of this crisis on her long-term willingness to accept necessary security measures. "If we maintain defensive positions, Isabella and Kieran remain targets until the threat is eliminated," Dontrell observed. "If we disrupt their operation, we eliminate the threat, but expose ourselves to combat engagement that could result in injuries or casualties." The tactical decision required balancing immediate risk against long-term security while considering the emotional impact on two children who had already experienced significant trauma from weeks of living under enhanced protective restrictions. "There's a third option," Dontrell said, recognizing a strategic possibility that utilized his military experience with hostage recovery and counter-terrorism operations. "We use myself as bait to draw the kidnapping team away from Isabella while creating opportunities for law enforcement to capture them without endangering the children." Victoria's face went pale as she processed that Dontrell was proposing to deliberately expose himself to lethal danger in order to protect her daughter. "Absolutely not," Victoria said immediately. "I won't ask you to risk your life for our family's problems. These people are threatening Isabella because of our wealth, not because of anything you've done. Ms. Blackstone, respectfully, this isn't about who's responsible for creating the threat. It's about utilizing available resources to neutralize danger that affects people I care about." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Isabella and Kieran, who had been monitoring security communications and understood that the situation had deteriorated beyond the manageable threat levels they'd been living with for weeks. "Dad," Kieran said, approaching Dontrell with the serious expression he used for family crisis discussions, "are you planning to do something dangerous to keep Isabella safe?" The 12-year-old's directness forced Dontrell to confront that his tactical decisions would affect his own son as well as Victoria's daughter, and that Kieran would have to live with whatever consequences resulted from his father's choices. "Kieran, I'm planning to use my training to solve a problem that threatens people we care about, but I need you to understand that sometimes protecting others requires accepting risks that feel scary. Dad, I understand that you want to help Isabella, but I also need you to stay alive because you're my only family." The statement was both supportive and heartbreaking, revealing a child's recognition that his father's heroic instincts could leave him orphaned if tactical operations went wrong. Isabella had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding that Dontrell was preparing to risk his life to protect her from consequences of her own poor decision-making 2 months earlier. "Mr. Hayes," Isabella said, "I can't let you put yourself in danger because of mistakes I made when I planned that fake kidnapping. If these people hurt you while trying to get to me, I'll never forgive myself." "Isabella, the people threatening you now made their own choices about criminal activity. Your previous mistakes don't make you responsible for their decisions or my response to protecting you." "But what if there's another way?" Isabella asked, her voice carrying desperate hope that tactical solutions might exist that didn't require the adults she cared about to face life-threatening danger. What kind of other way? Victoria asked, recognizing that Isabella might have insights about the situation that adults focused on threat assessment had overlooked. What if I cooperate with the kidnapping attempt in a controlled way that lets law enforcement capture the criminals without anyone getting hurt? The suggestion was both naive and strategically interesting, proposing to use Isabella as bait while maintaining protective oversight that could prevent actual harm. Absolutely not, both Victoria and Dontrell said simultaneously, recognizing that Isabella's proposal involved exposing her to exactly the kind of danger they'd spent months trying to prevent. But if Mr. Hayes can use himself as bait, why can't I use myself as bait? Isabella persisted. I'm the person they actually want, so I might be more effective at drawing them into positions where police can arrest them. Because you're 16 years old, Victoria replied, and because tactical operations require training and experience you don't possess. The debate continued for 20 minutes, with Isabella arguing for controlled cooperation while the adults insisted on protective strategies that kept her isolated from direct contact with the kidnapping team. But the discussion became academic when Marcus received intelligence that the criminal organization had moved to active implementation of their abduction plan, positioning vehicles and personnel for an operation that could begin within the next hour. We're out of time for strategic planning, Marcus announced. We need to implement protective measures immediately or risk losing control of the situation entirely. Dontrell looked at Victoria, then at Isabella and Chiron, recognizing that the next few hours would determine whether their collaborative approach to security could survive its most serious test. Everyone needs to understand that this situation is different from the manageable threats we've been dealing with, Dontrell said. These people have military training, sophisticated equipment, and detailed intelligence about our protective capabilities. Following instructions exactly and trusting each other completely isn't optional. It's the only way everyone survives this. As they prepared to implement emergency protocols that would either neutralize the kidnapping threat or expose all of them to dangers that could result in serious injury or death, Isabella realized that her desire for independence and normal teenage experiences had led to consequences far more serious than anything she'd imagined when she'd first rebelled against her mother's protective restrictions. Some confrontations, she was learning, involved not just personal family conflicts, but genuine life-or-death situations where poor judgment could endanger everyone you cared about. The question now was whether their extended family unit had developed enough trust and tactical coordination to survive professional criminals whose expertise was designed specifically to overcome the kind of security measures they'd been implementing. 18 months after the kidnapping crisis that had nearly destroyed their family, Dontrell stood in the graduation ceremony audience at Manhattan Preparatory Academy, watching Isabella deliver the valedictorian speech to a crowd that included not just her mother, but the extended family network that had formed through shared crisis and mutual support. 2 years ago, Isabella said from the podium, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed through months of therapy, security training, and gradual expansion of independence that honored both safety and autonomy needs. I thought that freedom meant the absence of restrictions. I've learned that real freedom means having the knowledge and skills to make good decisions when restrictions aren't there to protect you from poor judgment. Victoria sat in the front row, wearing the expression of pride mixed with amazement that characterized her relationship with the daughter who had transformed from desperate rebellion to mature leadership through circumstances neither of them could have anticipated. Beside Victoria, Kieran applauded enthusiastically for the girl who had become his closest friend, and something approaching a sister during the 18 months they'd spent navigating the complex dynamics of blended family relationships that transcended traditional social boundaries. Isabella's graduation speech reflects exactly the kind of wisdom we hoped she'd develop, Dontrell said to Marcus Webb, who had become both professional colleague and personal friend during their collaboration on security arrangements that balance protection with normal teenage development. At 18, Isabella possessed the social skills, risk assessment capabilities, and emotional maturity that had been impossible to develop under the comprehensive isolation that had characterized her earlier adolescence. More importantly, she'd learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear, between protective love and controlling manipulation. "Dad," Kieran whispered during the ceremony, "remember when Isabella used to complain that she'd never be allowed to do normal things? Now she's going to Columbia in the fall, with a security arrangement that lets her live in regular dorms and participate in student activities." The achievement represented successful implementation of graduated independence that had taken 18 months to develop through careful collaboration between family members, security professionals, and therapeutic specialists who understood both protective requirements and developmental needs. Following the graduation ceremony, Isabella's celebration dinner took place not in an exclusive restaurant with comprehensive security screening, but in a neighborhood establishment that Victoria had learned to evaluate through threat assessment rather than elimination of all potential risks. "Isabella," Victoria said, as their extended family gathered around the table, "I want you to know how proud I am of the person you've become, but more importantly, how grateful I am for what you've taught me about the difference between protection and control." The acknowledgement represented fundamental transformation in Victoria's parenting philosophy that had required months of family therapy, security consultation, and personal reflection about her own childhood experiences with protective versus controlling family dynamics. "Mom, what you've taught me is that effective protection requires collaboration rather than compliance," Isabella replied. "The security arrangements we have now work because I understand the reasons for restrictions and participate in developing solutions rather than just following rules I'm not allowed to question." Dontrell observed this exchange with satisfaction that came from witnessing the successful resolution of family conflicts that had once seemed intractable. His role in their lives had evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing consultation that helped them navigate normal challenges without returning to patterns of control and rebellion. "Mr. Hayes," Isabella continued, addressing Dontrell directly, "I want to thank you for teaching me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to make good decisions when you're afraid." The lesson had emerged during the months following the kidnapping crisis, when Isabella had needed to develop practical skills for managing anxiety about genuine threats without allowing fear to eliminate all normal activities and relationships. "Isabella, what you've taught me is that protecting people means preparing them to protect themselves," Dontrell replied. "The security training you've completed over the past 18 months ensures that you can recognize and respond to genuine dangers while pursuing the education and relationships you need for adult development." As the celebration continued and conversation ranged from Isabella's college plans to Kieran's upcoming transition to high school, everyone understood that their family unit had been permanently altered by circumstances that had forced them to confront fundamental questions about love, protection, trust, and independence. "Dontrell," Victoria said as the evening concluded, "I want to discuss something with you about long-term arrangements for our families." The conversation took place privately, while Isabella and Kieran collaborated on a photography project documenting their friendship over the past 18 months. a relationship that had provided both children with perspectives they couldn't have gained within their original family structures. Victoria, what kind of arrangements are you thinking about? I'm thinking about formalizing the relationship between our families in ways that reflect how much we've come to depend on each other for emotional support, practical assistance, and shared decision-making about the children's development. Victoria's suggestion was both practical and emotional, acknowledging that their partnership had evolved beyond professional consultation into mutual dependence that resembled extended family relationships. What would formalization look like? Shared custody arrangements that give you legal authority to make decisions about Isabella's welfare when I'm traveling. Financial support that ensures Kyron has access to the same educational and cultural opportunities Isabella enjoys. And living arrangements that allow both children to maintain their friendship without being separated by our different economic circumstances. The proposal was generous and complex, addressing practical inequalities between their families while creating legal framework for their ongoing collaboration in child-rearing responsibilities. Victoria, that's incredibly thoughtful, but I want to make sure we're making decisions based on what serves the children's needs rather than our adult desire to maintain the supportive relationship we've developed. Dontrell, what serves Isabella's needs is having access to the kind of authentic friendship and practical wisdom that Kyron provides. What serves Kyron's needs is having access to educational and cultural opportunities that my resources can provide. Their conversation was interrupted by Isabella and Kyron, who had been listening from the adjacent room with the shameless eavesdropping that characterized teenagers presented with adult discussions about their futures. "Ms. Victoria," Kyron said, "are you asking if Isabella and I can be like actual brother and sister instead of just friends whose parents work together? And are you asking if our families can live close enough to each other that we don't have to coordinate schedules every time we want to hang out?" Isabella added. The directness of their questions revealed that both children had been hoping for exactly the kind of formal family integration that Victoria was proposing. "What do you think about those possibilities?" Dontrell asked, recognizing that any decision would need to serve his son's long-term interests as well as immediate desires. "I think," Kieran said with 14-year-old wisdom, "that the best families are the ones you choose because you care about each other, not just the ones you're born into. And I think," Isabella added, "that having a brother who understands normal teenager problems while having parents who can provide security and opportunities sounds like the best possible combination." 6 months later, Dontrell stood in the kitchen of the brownstone that Victoria had purchased in Brooklyn, preparing breakfast for both children while Isabella packed for her second semester at Columbia and Kieran organized materials for the science fair project he'd been developing with resources that would have been impossible to access without Victoria's support. "Dad," Kieran said, "do you ever miss the apartment in Queens and the time when it was just you and me figuring everything out together?" The question was both nostalgic and practical, reflecting Kieran's ongoing process of integrating expanded family relationships with appreciation for the close partnership he and Dontrell had maintained during years when they depended entirely on each other. "I miss some things about our independence," Dontrell replied honestly, "but I don't miss the limitations we faced or the worry I carried about providing you with opportunities I couldn't afford." "What about the worry that Isabella and Ms. Victoria might decide they don't want to be part of our family anymore?" "Kieran, that's always a possibility with any relationship, but families that choose each other tend to be more committed than families that are just connected by genetics or legal obligation." As Isabella and Kieran prepared for their respective schools, and Victoria reviewed the security and educational arrangements that had become routine rather than crisis management, all 4 members of their chosen family understood that they had created something unprecedented in their individual experiences. They had built family relationships based on mutual support during crisis, shared values about protection and independence, and genuine affection that transcended the economic and social differences that had initially made their connection seem impossible. "Isabella," Dontrell said as she prepared to leave for college, "remember that everything we've taught you about security and decision-making is designed to help you build the kind of life you actually want, not to limit your choices out of fear. And remember," Victoria added, "that families support each other through mistakes and challenges, so you don't have to be perfect to deserve love and protection." As Isabella headed to Columbia and Kyron to his high school classes, both carrying the confidence that came from growing up in families that had learned to balance safety with independence, protection with trust, and love with respect for individual autonomy, Dontrell and Victoria recognized that their partnership had succeeded in its most important goal. They had raised children who understood that genuine security came not from eliminating all risks, but from developing the knowledge, skills, and relationships necessary to navigate an uncertain world with courage and wisdom. Some families, they had discovered, were created not through biological connection or legal arrangement, but through shared commitment to helping each other become the best possible versions of themselves while remaining safe in a world that contained both genuine dangers and unlimited possibilities for growth and connection. This story reminds us that the people who love us most can sometimes become our greatest obstacles when protection transforms into control, and that genuine security comes from developing competence and wisdom rather than from eliminating all possible risks. In a world where fear often drives us to restrict those we love, Dontrell and Victoria's journey shows us that effective protection requires trust, collaboration, and the courage to help others develop independence gradually rather than maintaining control indefinitely. Sometimes, the most profound acts of love involve teaching others to protect themselves, and the strongest families are built through shared challenges that reveal our capacity for growth, understanding, and mutual support. What freedoms are you denying others in the name of protection? What risks might you need to accept to help those you love develop the competence they need to thrive independently? Like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the courage to balance safety with independence, the importance of addressing family conflicts through collaboration rather than control, and the truth that the most meaningful relationships are built through choice, trust, and mutual respect rather than obligation or authority.